Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Today's topic, did God become a man? Love it. Philippians chapter 2, coming to you right now. Welcome back, Rabbi. How are you?
How are you doing there, William?
I am making it. I am surviving, Baruch Hashem, indeed. Good to be.
You were the survivor.
Maybe I should change the theme song name to that, something like I Will Survive. Oh, that's funny. A couple people have asked me over the years, the secular song, when you call into the studio, the sound that plays or the music that plays as the on hold music is an old song, but in the 80s called Talk About It. Talk About leaving is what the whole point of leaving, because I was leaving Christianity at the time, so it made a lot of sense. But it's kind of fun hip hop. So anyway, not sure why that came all out. Let me make sure I've even got things rolling here, and I forgot. I got to put us on screen so people can see us. And outside of that, we're doing great. Yes, I'll get a message in a minute from Deanna, say, "Hey, where you at?" That's okay though. She's great at, man. All right, see if I can get some things to disappear. Yep, there it is right there. There's my message. Like clockwork. That's funny.
Someone's on the ball.
Hey, let me turn my Bluetooth off so I can hear. There you go. I guess she figured it out. She hung up. All right, very nice, very nice. Love this world, that's for sure. Well, Rabbi, it's good to have you. It's good to have you again, as always.
Good to be back.
Yes, sir. Very nice. So we will. I won't hold you up any longer. Glad to see you're doing well, and looking forward to hearing what you've got to say on this topic.
So, like a lot of what we've seen in Paul's letters, he shares things that are very, in many ways, appropriate, for a human audience. He gives people directives in terms of how to live a moral life and how to live a proper life. And so, for those parts, as we've said many times before, whatever is wonderful in the New Testament is not new. And so these are all teachings that we already have in the Torah. And, when Paul seconds that and Paul piggybacks on that, what can we say? So just to give an example, the beginning of this chapter is basically a message of how it's important to put others first. He writes in verse 3, he says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility." Obviously, humility is a major teaching in the Tanakh. He says, "Count others more significant than yourselves." So again, this is a very common teaching we find, in the rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, for example, in Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. So we find many places where we have similar messages. For example, in chapter 2, Mishnah 15, Rabbi Eliezer says, "Let your fellow's honor be as dear to you as your own." Again, pretty much the same kind of teaching as Paul. And in chapter 3, in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, Mishnah 13, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa says that if the spirit of one's fellow is pleased with him, then the spirit of the Almighty is also pleased with him. But if the spirit of one's fellow is not pleased with him, then the spirit of the Almighty is not pleased with him. Meaning that we basically have to get along with others for God to really judge us in an appropriate way. And obviously, you're not going to get along with others if you're always arrogant and you're always putting yourself first. So obviously, this requires that people use discernment. You don't put people first all the time over yourself, because then you become a doormat. And the Torah actually teaches chayecha kodmin, that ultimately your life comes first. The famous teaching in the Talmud, if there are two people that are wandering in the desert and they ran out of water, and one of them has a jug of water, and it's only enough for one of them, so they could split it, but then they're both going to die. They don't have enough water for the both of them to last until they can get new water. The person that has the water can just give it away and let the other person live and let himself die. But that's not considered the appropriate action, meaning that if you have the water, obviously that was what was meant to be. And you don't take it out of your own possession and give it to someone else at the risk, basically, you're basically committing suicide. That's not allowed. You're not allowed to commit suicide. Unfortunately, you're not able to save this other person, but you never know, meaning that given what you have in front of you now, the water is only enough for one of you. Talmud teaches, Chayecha Kodem, and your life comes first. And but you never know. That doesn't mean that a miracle couldn't happen. Doesn't mean that you're going to sort of find water that you didn't expect. It could be that your friend will live. But there's no blanket policy of always putting others first and you becoming a doormat. But the truth is that you have to, in many cases, put others first. And you certainly have to always accord other people honor. And you have to, as the Talmud says, you have to consider the honor of your fellow as dear as your own honor, meaning that if you feel that you deserve to be treated with a certain amount of respect and honor, so at least that much goes to your friend and others as well. So again, these teachings of Paul pretty much will find a comfortable place more or less in Jewish literature, Torah literature as well. Now, what's fascinating is that this very prosaic beginning of the chapter, where Paul speaks about the importance of counting, giving other people consideration and counting others, what he says, more significant than yourself. So he says that he's going to go on to say that this is actually following the lead of Jesus. And he goes into a very famous, some people think it's a hymn, but it's a little passage here where Paul seems to speak about the pre-existence of Jesus, that he, again, according to some interpretations, has been an eternal being. And we're going to have to discuss this because this seems to point in the direction of Paul describing Jesus as divine. But he goes into a number of verses here, speaking very significantly, meaning that this seems to be a mega significant, like a tremendously significant doctrinal teaching in these verses from verse 6 through 9, I think. It's a short little section, but it's oozing with significance theologically. But what's fascinating is that it's not really the point of the discussion, meaning it's only coming, these few verses where Paul speaks about the nature of Jesus and who he was, which really in terms of theology is a massively significant piece, but it's only coming to buttress, to reinforce his primary lesson in this chapter, or at least at this point in the chapter, which is that we should put others first. And he says, almost in parentheses here, just like Jesus did. And so in the context of this little section we're going to get into now is interesting to me because, number one, it's not really almost an independent topic where Paul is going to really bring in critical information about the nature of Jesus. It's parenthetical. It's all coming to support what Paul began saying, which is that it's important that we consider others and put others first. And he says now, almost in parentheses, and this is what Jesus did. And then he gets into, as a result of this sort of parenthetical comment, his comments about the nature of Jesus. So the truth is that to really go through these 3 or 4 verses would take us several hours. And I don't want to drag this on that long. So we're just going to hit a few key points and really some points for further exploration and for just to think about. But these are really, really major topics. And it's really, there are quite a few of them. So to really unpack it thoroughly would really take, many hours. So let's go slowly through the key verses. So Paul has here in verse 6, and again, he's speaking about Jesus. He says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, he begins by saying that Jesus was in the form of God. The truth is that we all are. Right? We know that at the very beginning of the Bible says that God created human beings in his image. So the fact that he speaks about Jesus being in the form of God, obviously that's not in and of itself unique. It's something which is true of all human beings. And when we speak about in the Bible humans being created in the image of God, it doesn't mean that we look like God. It doesn't mean that God has a physical form and we look just like him. The word image here, it has the connotation of essence, meaning that there's something in terms of the nature of God that we have in common with God, meaning that we have free will, at least in terms of our moral free choices, and God acts independently out of a freedom of will. God is not compelled to act in any way. So by human beings being created in the image of God, we have that in common with God, as opposed to everything else in creation. Nothing else really has that kind of free will. Everything really acts in the world instinctually. They don't make intelligent, moral, free will choices. And also that we have an intellect. We can think and we can, consider things. And so the fact that we have an intellect, the fact that we have free will, are aspects of the human being that we have in common with God. And that's really what the Bible is teaching in Genesis when it says we were created in the image of God, in the form of God. It obviously does not mean that, we somehow look exactly like God looks. Now, the second part of this verse, of verse 6, is not so easy to understand. When Paul says that Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. So the way most of the commentaries to the Christian Bible explain this is that basically they explain that Jesus didn't hold fast to his equality with God, and he willingly gave it up. I found this in a number of commentaries. For example, John MacArthur says basically this, that when Paul says here that Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, it means he didn't see it as something he definitely needed to hold on to, and therefore he was willing to give it up for a season, which is what John MacArthur says. He didn't give it up permanently. Now, what does it mean that he gave up his divinity for a season? So David Stern and many of the commentaries say that it doesn't mean that Jesus gave up his divinity. As we'll see, the sort of standard Christian understanding is that Jesus was fully God. So he didn't give up any of his divinity, but according to the commentaries, he gave up the privileges, or some of the privileges, of divinity. For example, independent authority would be an example of something that Jesus willingly gave up. And you'll see that throughout the Christian Bible, Jesus submits himself to the will of the Father. Now, if the Father and the Son, Jesus and the Father, are co-equal, and basically the exact same. You don't have to give up your authority to another part of the Trinity. You both have, you each have independent authority. But they say that Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be held onto. He gave this up willingly. And so a number of things, the commentaries point out that Jesus was willing to give up. And one of them, as an example, was his independent authority. He submitted himself to the Father, to God the Father. Now, the commentaries again end up by saying, but Jesus was fully God and fully human, totally God and totally human. And obviously, this is an impossibility. It's actually an absurd contradiction in terms, because it's not possible. Someone who is 100% human cannot also be 100% divine, 100% God, because by definition, a person who is fully human is not God. That's not normal for a human being. I mean, I would consider myself to be fully human, and I'm not divine. I'm not God at the same time. And so the claim that Jesus or anyone is at the same time fully God and fully human is a contradiction in terms. By definition, God is not human. And therefore, to say that someone is at the same time fully God and fully human is basically an absurdity. The Nelson Study Bible says that Jesus was fully man, fully human, except that he was sinless, except that he didn't sin. And that also is an impossibility, because we know that there are at least 3 times in the Tanakh where we're told that every human being sins. We know that in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're told that there isn't a righteous person in the world who only does good and never sins, meaning even a righteous person will sin. And the book of Job, Eov, he says twice that every being, anyone born of a woman, and we know that in the Christian Bible, Jesus is born of a woman. So the book of Job says that anyone born of a woman is imperfect and will sin. So again, to say that Jesus was fully human but didn't sin, again, doesn't really make too much sense. Now, the first part of the verse where he speaks about Jesus was in the form of God, many of the commentaries insist that this speaks about his pre-existence. Now, in David Stern's commentary, David Stern again wrote the Jewish New Testament commentary. The whole point of his commentary is to show that Christian belief is not a departure from Judaism. His entire commentary has the agenda, has the goal of trying to prove that everything in the Christian Bible is totally consistent with both the Tanakh and with the teachings of the sages, the Jewish sages. So in his commentary here, David Stern writes the following. He says, the pre-existence of Messiah is a familiar concept in rabbinic Judaism. He's trying to say, when you read Philippians, David Stern is saying, don't freak out and say, oh, that's against Judaism. That's, the idea that the Messiah is a pre-existent being, and has existed eternally with God. That don't get freaked out by that, David Stern says. He says this is a very familiar concept in rabbinic Judaism. It's interesting that, he doesn't appeal to the Tanakh. He doesn't, at this point in his commentary say, don't get bent out of shape. The scriptures tell us that the Messiah is going to be a pre-existent being. He jumps, like many Christian apologists do, when the Tanakh does not support their theology, they often jump to the rabbis and what the Talmud says. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes really deconstructing this comment by David Stern. So he says again, anyone familiar with Rabbinic Judaism will be familiar with this concept of the pre-existence of the Messiah. Now, I'm going to examine two sources that may be what David Stern's referring to. One is from the Talmud, Tractate Pesachim, 54a. And there the Talmud says that there were 7 things created before the world was created. 7 things created before the world was created. And they mention Torah, repentance, tshuva, Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, Gehenna, the throne of glory, the Kisei HaKavod, and the name of the Messiah. So there are 2 observations here that we need to make. Number one is that the Talmud says that these things were created before the world was created. It doesn't say that these things are eternal and have existed throughout time forever and ever and ever as long as God has been around. It doesn't say that. It just says they predate the creation of the rest of the world. So this is really a twisting and distortion of what the Talmud is saying. And secondly, if you were listening, the Talmud does not say that the Messiah was created before the world was created. It says the name of the Messiah was created before the world, meaning that the idea, this is what it really means, and I'll prove this in a second, it means that the idea of the Messiah was something that predated the creation of the world. Before the world was created, God already had the idea of the Messiah. Just a third point to make is that once the Talmud says that the Messiah, even if it said Messiah, it doesn't, it says the name of the Messiah, but even if it had said Messiah was created before the world was created, that would not prove that the Messiah is eternal. It would prove the opposite, meaning that if the Messiah had to be created, it means that God was there before the Messiah to create him. And obviously, the Talmud here mentions all these other things like, the throne of glory and the Garden of Eden. Obviously, I don't think any Christians would believe that all these things are eternal and have been around as long as God has been around. So all you see here is a passage in the Talmud that has been co-opted by Christian apologists to prove a point that the Talmud not only is not making, but the Talmud actually teaches directly against the point of the Christian apologists. Now, there's a second source that I wanted to look at, and I found this one in a very well-known Messianic website, and they quote from the Midrash. This is not the Talmud. This is Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, 1:4, meaning that the first chapter and the 4th paragraph. And this is the way it's quoted. Listen carefully. In the Messianic website, they quote it like this: 6 things preceded creation. The Messiah was one of them. So again, the idea that the Messiah preceded creation. Now, again, of course, we have the same problem. It doesn't say that the Messiah goes back eternally in time. It just says that the Messiah preceded creation. Could have been, just before the world was created, and there could have been eternities before that. So even if they're quoting the Midrash here properly, it doesn't prove what they would like it to prove. But we're going to see that they actually misquoted this passage from the Midrash. Again, the Messianic website says 6 things preceded creation. The Messiah was one of them. The actual text of the Midrash says that 6 things preceded the creation of the world. 2 were actually created before the world was created: the Torah and the throne of glory. 4 things, it was decided to create them. They weren't actually created. There was a decision to create 4 things before the world was created, and those 4 things are the Avot, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel, the entity of the Jewish people, the people of Israel. The temple, Jerusalem temple. And the name of the Messiah. Again, not the Messiah, the name of the Messiah. And not that the Messiah was created before the world, but it was decided before the world was created to have a Messiah. So again, all we see in the rabbinic literature is that the idea, the concept of Messiah preceded the world. There's nothing which speaks about the Messiah being eternal as God is eternal. And again, this is an important thing to understand. I just wanted to bring in one source that's often used by Christians. And again, I mentioned that, there are actually dozens and dozens of sources that we could examine tonight. We just don't have time to go through everything. But I think these are typical sources. One of the sources used by Christians in the Tanakh to try to prove that Jesus is eternal is from the prophet Micah, or sometimes it's pronounced Micah, chapter 5. And again, they insist this is actually a prophecy about Jesus. Again, look up any Jewish commentary, you'll see that it's not. But the important point is that it speaks about the descendant of David being someone whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Now again, the Christian assumption is that this is referring to Jesus, and it says here, according to the Christian assumption, that the origin of Jesus is from of old, from ancient days. And again, the traditional interpretation is that this means that for eternity, that the origin of Jesus, the Messiah, according to Christianity, goes back eternally, meaning that it goes back to the beginning of time, which would mean that the Messiah, from a Christian point of view, is eternal, and that would mean that the Messiah is actually God, is divine. The problem is that this phrase, someone, the origin of something being of old, of ancient days. So we find these expressions many times in the Tanakh. And it doesn't mean going back eternally. It just means ancient. It means very old. For example, you'll find that in Isaiah chapter 23, verse 7, it says, "Is this your joyous city whose antiquity is of ancient days?" So no one there is saying that the city goes back to before the creation of the world. Or Malachi chapter 3, verse 4. "Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years." Again, no one would suggest that the sacrifices go back in eternally in time. Or in the book of Micah, the prophet Micah, chapter 7, in verse 14 and verse 20, this expression comes up. In verse 14, "Feed your people with your rod, the flock of your heritage, which dwells solitarily in the wood, in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old." Again, no one's going to suggest that this is referring to a time going back eternally. It means in olden days. Or in the same chapter, chapter 7, verse 20, you will perform the truth to Jacob and the mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. Again, just referring to ancient days. Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 26, "And I'll deliver them into the hand of those that seek their lives, and into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hands of his servants, and afterward it shall be inhabited as in the days of old, says the Lord." Again, no one's going to suggest that, they're going to inhabit these cities, as they were inhabited before the creation of the world. Amos chapter 9, verse 11, "In that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I'll raise up its ruins, and I'll build it as in the days of old." Again, this is referring to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. No one's going to suggest that it existed with God since the beginning of time. We saw that according to some, the idea of the temple preceded the creation of the world, but here it simply means that the temple will be restored and it'll be like the one that existed in ancient days, the first temple. Isaiah chapter 51, verse 9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord, awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. So again, when it speaks about generations of old, it doesn't mean generations that existed, all the way going back in time to eternity. So again, there are attempts by Christian apologists to show both in the Tanakh and in rabbinic literature that the Messiah will be eternal, but that's clearly not the case. Now, we'll continue on the same theme. In verse 7, Paul says that Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So this is the idea, what Christians call incarnation, that God basically, they say, who emptied himself? Well, Jesus did, according to this theory, and they believe Jesus is God. He emptied himself of some of his divine privileges, and he took on the form of a man. That's essentially the idea of incarnation. Again, this seems to be a passage that speaks about Jesus as being divine. We're going to get back to this in a few minutes, but let's just, again, unpack this idea. The idea of the Messiah being God, or God coming into the world as a human being, God taking on human form and living amongst us. So the important thing to understand is that anyone that has carefully read the Tanakh would be very shocked to hear such an idea. I think that it's not clear to me. I certainly don't believe that Jesus claimed to be God, but had he made such a claim in the first century, obviously the Jewish people would have been shocked. They try to say that that's exactly what happened. They try to show there are certain stories where Jesus seems to say things that are provocative along these lines, and people are blown away and shocked. They accuse him of blasphemy and of idolatry. So this is obviously an incredibly huge departure from the Tanakh. And so the first thing to just be aware of is that this is something that would be incredible news in the first century, that God comes to the world as a human being. And the problem is that in the entire Tanakh, in the entire scope of the Hebrew scriptures, there is no prediction, no forecast that one day this was going to happen, that they should know in advance that one day this is exactly what God would do. God would come into the world, take on human form, and live amongst us. It's just not there in the Tanakh. And it's the kind of thing you certainly would expect that if God planned to do that, he would let people know about it. The important thing, by the way, is that anyone that would seek to find any evidence for this in the Tanakh has to be very careful to make sure they're reading passages that in context are actually speaking about God and the nature of God. What Christian apologists tend to do is to find allusions to their theology in passages where the actual context of the passage has nothing to do with what they're trying to prove. So this is just a challenge, I would say, that anyone who goes through the Tanakh, and I actually have done this a number of times, I actually made a mark in my Tanakh, every time the Tanakh actually speaks about God and about the nature of God. And what was interesting is that in none of these passages that in context are speaking about God, is there any clue, even a remote clue, that we should understand God as a Trinity, or that God would one day come to the world and take on human form. So not only does the Tanakh not say that God would come and take on the form of a human being, the Tanakh consistently says the exact opposite. So in the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 19, God tells us, I am not a man. Now, if God's intention was to come to the world as a human being, so why tell us in the Tanakh, I am not a human being? That sort of is contradicting what he planned to do. We see the same idea in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 29, where God again says that he's not a human being. Also, we find this very clearly in the book of Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11 is one of the clearest prophecies about the Messiah who will come. And what it tells us about the Messiah is that he will be someone who fears God. Now, that would have been a perfect place for Isaiah to tell us that the Messiah will be God. But no, the prophet Isaiah tells us the Messiah will be someone who fears God. Obviously, the Messiah will not be God if he fears God. And then we've mentioned numerous times in these programs that the Hebrew scriptures consistently distinguish between God and the Messiah. It speaks about God and the Messiah not as the same entity, as the same being, but it distinguishes between them. Now, one of the more important, I think, significant verses in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 10, is where God says that the people of Israel are his witnesses. And it means that we are the witnesses about God. We are his witnesses, meaning that God put the Jewish people, the people of Israel, in the world to testify about him, to bear witness in the world about God. And if the world wants to know about God, we are the address for them to come to. We've always pointed out that this is one of the prophecies about the Messianic age. The prophet Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23 says that one day the world's going to get it, and that the nations of the world, the people of the world, are going to come finally to the Jewish people and say, we want to follow you because we know that God is with you. So this is what God tells the Jewish people, that you are my witnesses. And the truth is that for the people of Israel, it's not a matter of having beliefs about God. The Torah says very dramatically in the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, God says that I demonstrated to you so that you should know that Hashem is the God. Meaning that God does not call on us to have faith in him, to say that we believe. Faith is something, and belief, for example, is something that you believe because you have reasons to believe. I have reasons to believe it's going to snow this week because all the weather reports say it. I don't know it as a fact. I have reason to believe that, that at Little Bighorn, General Custer and his army was in a battle with Sitting Bull. I don't know that from myself. I wasn't there, but I happen to reason to believe it because I trust the historical accounts. But there are certain things that we don't have faith in or we don't believe, but we know. I know I have 5 fingers on my hand. I know that I'm the natural born child of my parents. I know that I'm on the Tanakh talk show now. There are certain things I know, and I have crystal clear consciousness. The reality is crystal clear. And so God says that about his making it clear, his showing the people of Israel that he is real, and that we should know, not just that we should believe that he's real, that we should know. So how did God show us? How did God demonstrate to us who he is and that he's real? So the Torah tells us throughout the book of Exodus and throughout the book of Deuteronomy that, especially chapters 4 and 5, that God did it through the experiences of the Exodus from Egypt, which included the year-long series of incredible miraculous plagues, followed by the splitting of the Red Sea, of the Yam Suf, where the Jewish nation was able to cross on dry land. And then as our pursuers entered in after us, the water went back and drowned them. And then finally, the most dramatic experience was 3 million people hearing God speak at Mount Sinai. And so it's not that we have belief or faith that God is real. We actually experience God. When Moses was sent to redeem the people of Israel from Egypt, Moses was a little bit concerned about the mission. And one of the questions he asked God was, what if they ask me your name? Now, we know that in the Bible, name always signifies essence. So when Moses was worried, what if they ask me your name? What he really was asking was, what if they want to know who you are? What am I going to tell them? And God says to Moses, I will be what I will be. Tell them I will be. Meaning that the answer God gives to Moses is, if they want to know who I am, God says, they'll see. I will be who I will be. They will experience me on the stage of history. They'll walk with me on the stage of history. And those experiences will make it very clear to them who I am. And that's exactly what happened. God made it dramatically clear to the people of Israel who he was and that he was real. And through these experiences, the people of Israel became electrically aware of God's reality. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, God says, Ata hareta, I showed you, lada'at, that you should know that Hashem is the God, and there is none other. There is no other. And these people who were shown by God who he is, we are God's witnesses. And what's interesting is that when you go through the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, one of the things that is repeated many times is that the definition of idolatry is the worship of any deity that our ancestors did not meet in these formative experiences. Any deity that our fathers did not know, this generation who came out of Egypt and stood at Mount Sinai, if they didn't experience it, the Torah says it's idolatry. We'll find, for example, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 13, it repeats this idea 3 times, at least 3 times, and many, many other times in the Bible. A God that you didn't know, a God your fathers didn't know. This is the hallmark. This is the benchmark. What is the experience of the Jewish people? What was our national experience? And the reality is that of that generation that stood at Mount Sinai and experienced the most awesome revelation of God in the history of humankind, none of them told their descendants that we understood and that we experienced God as a Trinity, or we experienced God as having some kind of human form. As a matter of fact, in Deuteronomy chapters 4 and 5, it repeats twice that God says, remember, you only heard a voice at Mount Sinai. You didn't see any form. There was nothing that you saw. And so if we didn't see God, as far as God is concerned, God is telling us that if anyone claims to be God and you can see them, then you know for sure they're not God, and that's idolatry. Matter of fact, when Moses said to God, show me your glory, God immediately says to Moses, you cannot see me and live. That was back in Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. So it's very critical to remember that the Bible tells us, and this is God speaking, that Israel, these people are my witnesses. Why are they my witnesses? Because I appeared to them. I revealed myself to them. And I made it clear to them. I showed them to know exactly who I am. And I defined for them any form of deity, any concept of deity that they did not experience, that they did not know. That is, by definition, idolatry. Now, one of the things that is worth bearing in mind is that the Christian narrative has a certain amount of appeal and power, Meaning, when you think about one of the most awesome questions that human beings could think about, which is, how do you bridge the chasm? How do you bridge the gap between an infinite, spiritual, eternal God and a finite, physical, temporal humanity? It seems like the gap is infinite, that there's no way of bridging it. So Christianity has its narrative, which says that no, the gap was bridged by God coming into our world, taking on human form and living amongst us, so that human beings can now have a connection to God. And that, I think, has a certain amount of appeal. There was a singer a few years ago, Joan Osborne, that had a song, what if God was one of us, just like that slob on the bus? But I think people related to that, boy, this is a God that we really can get to know. We can even go out and have a beer with him because he's human, just like we are. And so I think that for many people, that's an appealing concept, the idea that God comes into our world, takes on human form to give us access to him. The problem is that this is the exact opposite of the narrative of the Tanakh. The Tanakh says that the gap between God and human beings is not going to be bridged by God becoming human. On the contrary, the Tanakh says that the gap is bridged by human beings becoming more godly. So, for example, in Leviticus chapter 19, God says to us, Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani. You people should become holy, just as I, God, am holy. That's the challenge that God holds out to us, that you human beings, you can stretch yourselves, and you could become more like me. And you're able to, as the Torah says, v'halachta b'drachav, walk in his ways. You can imitate God. You can become a godly person by studying God's Torah, by entering into the mind of God, by being obedient to God, and by perfecting your character traits over the course of years and decades and a lifetime, working on improving and growing spiritually. Human beings have the ability to grow and to develop and to change. That's why we're here in this world. And so the format of the Torah is that we can get closer to God by becoming more godly. And the Torah never tells us that that gap will be bridged by God becoming more human. The Christian world tends to see Jesus as a doorway, that Jesus becomes an intermediary, that Jesus helps us connect to God. But the reality is we never needed Jesus to connect with God. David wrote, David's someone whose whole soul was on fire for God. David wrote in Psalm chapter 145, verse 18, that God is near to all who call upon him in truth. We don't need Jesus to get close to God. We always say, if the system is not broken, don't fix it. And so the reality that God first entered into in the Tanakh is a reality that doesn't need the repair of Jesus coming into the world. God told us that we live in a world where we can relate to him, we can know him, we can have a relationship with him, and if we break that relationship, we're able to directly come to him and ask for forgiveness. And so the Christian narrative here of the gap between God and human beings being bridged by the incarnation is maybe compelling to some people, but it's against the entire narrative of the Tanakh. Okay, we're running out of time here.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's go to verse 9, because I want to start wrapping up. In verse 9, Paul writes, "Therefore God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name." Now, this is again a problem, because if Jesus is already God, it doesn't make much sense for God to highly exalt him. God does not have to exalt God. So most Christians understand that this is referring primarily to Jesus in his humanity, and he was exalted by God, after they claim he was resurrected. And various Christian commentaries say that, incredibly, after his resurrection, Jesus had a higher state of glory than before his incarnation. Now, if you just think about that for a minute, it really boggles the mind. Meaning that the Christian claim is that before Jesus was incarnated, meaning that prior to him coming to this world as a human being, he existed eternally with the Father. And obviously, from a theological point of view, he had a certain amount of glory equal to the glory of the Father. And now the Christian commentaries claim that in verse 9, when it says that God highly exalted him, they say that now, after he is resurrected, he now has a higher state of glory even than prior to his incarnation. Now, this is obviously impossible because you can't have God's glory increasing. You can't get more than infinite, would be the mathematical way of saying it. I think I'm going to close out this. There really is quite a bit more that I didn't get to.
Okay.
But I wanted to just look quickly before we break for tonight at verses 19 to 30. And this is an observation I've made several times in the past, especially when we looked at Paul's letters. But if you look at what Paul writes here, he says, I hope to the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon. He's writing to the Philippians. He said, I hope to send Timothy to you soon so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of the Messiah Jesus. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will also come. And you can go on to the rest of the chapter. My observation is that this seems to me to be a personal letter that Paul is writing. And it's very hard to say that this is divine revelation. We've seen many other passages where it's pretty clear that Paul is basically just writing a personal letter. It's coming from him. It's not really very elevated in its message. We saw in the past, he says, I forgot to bring certain things. It's the kind of letter that you would write to any friend that you were going to go meet. And if you just carefully read and try to sense the tone and the quality of the end of this chapter from verse 19 to 33, you'll see that it strikes one as being pretty much just a personal missive, personal letter from Paul to the Philippians. And it really, I don't think, could be seen as anything more than that. Sorry for not getting to all the things I wanted to get to, but it would take probably 2 or 3 hours. So with that introduction to Philippians 2, I think we'll end at this point.
Okay, it sounds like a fair plan. So if we need to cover more next week, we can. However you want to work that out is fine.
No one's going to sue me, right?
No. And this is your show anyway, so it doesn't matter. Very good.
All right, we'll see. Maybe we'll do a part 2.
Okay.
But I plan on going into chapter 3. If there's anything that's really critical that I think we should just double back and reinforce, maybe I'll make mention of that.
Okay, fair enough. That sounds good. Well, once again, thank you for your time, Rabbi, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. And for all you people out there as well, see you later, people. Shalom, shalom, everybody. Bye.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.
חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, זה טבעם של אנשים שונים.
נזכור בסוף כולנו שותפים.